What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends faces off against late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Robert De Niro sits down with Jimmy Kimmel, expecting a routine promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in an ambush that would shake the entertainment industry to its core. The tension that erupted last night between these two powerhouses created a moment so explosive, so raw, that viewers are still trying to process what they witnessed. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when respect meets disrespect, when legendary status collides with cheap shots, and when a master of his craft refuses to be made a fool of on national television. The stage was set for what appeared to be a standard promotional appearance. Robert De Niro, the two-time Academy Award winner whose career spans over 5 decades, had agreed to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live to discuss his latest project. The 80-year-old acting legend, known for his intense preparation and professional demeanor, walked onto the soundstage with the same measured confidence that had defined his career. The audience erupted in appreciation for the man who had given them Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, and Vito Corleone. But something felt different from the moment De Niro settled into the guest chair. Kimmel's usual pre-interview banter carried an edge that seasoned observers of late-night television immediately recognized. The host's smile seemed forced, his jokes landing with deliberate sharpness rather than genuine humor. Those familiar with Kimmel's recent controversial interviews could sense the host was preparing for something more confrontational than promotional. The interview began innocuously enough, with Kimmel asking about De Niro's upcoming film and his legendary method acting approach. De Niro, ever the professional, answered thoughtfully, sharing insights about his craft with the kind of depth that only comes from decades of experience. His responses were measured, respectful, and exactly what viewers expected from an actor of his caliber. The audience hung on every word, clearly in awe of being in the presence of cinematic royalty. But Kimmel wasn't content to let this remain a respectful conversation about artistry and legacy. As De Niro finished explaining his preparation process for a particularly challenging role, the host's demeanor shifted noticeably. His posture became more aggressive, leaning forward with the predatory instinct of someone who had found their target. The comedian's eyes gleamed with the kind of anticipation that suggested he had been planning this moment long before De Niro had even arrived at the studio. "You know, Bob," Kimmel interrupted, using the familiar nickname without invitation, "I have to ask you about something that's been bothering a lot of people." The way he emphasized bothering sent a chill through the studio audience. De Niro's expression remained neutral, but those who knew the actor's work could recognize the subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested his famous intensity was beginning to surface. The veteran actor waited, giving Kimmel space to continue, demonstrating the kind of professional courtesy that had earned him respect throughout Hollywood. But that courtesy was about to be tested in ways that no promotional appearance should ever demand. Kimmel's next words would mark the point where a routine interview transformed into something far more sinister. "Your political statements have been pretty intense lately," Kimmel continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who believed they held all the cards. "Some people are saying you've lost touch with reality, that you're just another out-of-touch Hollywood elite telling regular Americans how to think." The host's smile never wavered, but there was nothing friendly about it now. This was the smile of someone enjoying the discomfort they were deliberately creating. The studio fell silent. Even the most casual observers could feel the atmosphere change, as if the very air had become charged with tension. De Niro's legendary composure was being tested in real time, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The actor's hands, which had been resting comfortably on the chair's armrests, slowly clenched into fists. "I think people have a right to speak their minds," De Niro replied, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that had made him one of cinema's most compelling performers. especially when they see things happening that they believe are wrong. His tone remained even, but there was steel underneath the words. This was a man who had built his career on authenticity, and he wasn't about to be diminished by cheap shots disguised as comedy. Kimmel sensed blood in the water and pressed forward. But don't you think there's a difference between speaking your mind and, I don't know, having a complete meltdown on camera? The host's question was accompanied by a chuckle that felt calculated to humiliate rather than entertain. The audience's discomfort was palpable now, with nervous laughter scattered throughout the studio, as people began to realize this wasn't the light-hearted celebrity interview they had expected. The legendary actor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "I've never had a meltdown," he said carefully, each word measured and precise. "I've expressed my opinions clearly and passionately about issues I care about. If that bothers some people, that's their problem, not mine." The response carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from a lifetime of commanding respect, but Kimmel seemed determined to chip away at that dignity. "Well, let's take a look at what you call expressing opinions," Kimmel said, gesturing toward the monitors. Around the studio, the implication was clear. He had prepared clips specifically designed to embarrass his guest, turning what should have been a celebration of a legendary career into a public trial. This was the moment when it became obvious that De Niro had walked into an ambush, and the trap was about to be sprung with calculated precision that would leave no doubt about the host's true intentions. The monitors flickered to life, displaying a carefully edited compilation of De Niro's most passionate political moments taken completely out of context. The clips had been spliced together to make the actor appear unhinged, removing the thoughtful commentary that had surrounded his original statements. It was a masterclass in manipulation, designed not to inform, but to humiliate. The editing was so obviously biased that even casual viewers could see the hit job for what it was. De Niro watched the montage with growing fury, his legendary self-control being tested beyond its limits. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The man who had spent decades perfecting his craft, who had earned the respect of peers and audiences worldwide, was being reduced to a caricature for cheap laughs. The disrespect wasn't just personal, it was an assault on everything he had worked to build throughout his career. "This is what you brought me here for?" De Niro's voice was low, dangerous, carrying the kind of quiet menace that had made his villainous roles so compelling. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The courteous professional was being replaced by something far more formidable. "You invite me to your show under false pretenses to ambush me with edited clips?" Kimmel's grin widened, clearly enjoying the reaction he was getting. "Hey, these are your words, Bob. I'm just showing people what you actually said." The host's tone was mocking, dismissive, as if he were speaking to a child rather than one of the most accomplished actors in cinema history. "Maybe if you don't want to look crazy, you shouldn't say crazy things." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The studio audience, which had been uncomfortably silent, now seemed to collectively hold its breath. They had come expecting entertainment, but they were witnessing something far more serious, a deliberate destruction of a man's reputation on live television. Some audience members began to shift uneasily in their seats, sensing that they were complicit in something ugly. De Niro stood up slowly, his movements controlled but radiating barely contained rage. At 80 years old, he still possessed the physical presence that had made him one of cinema's most intimidating figures. His eyes, which had conveyed everything from tender love to murderous intent on screen, now focused on Kimmel with laser-like intensity. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "You sit behind your desk making jokes while the world burns, and you have the audacity to call me crazy?" The host leaned back in his chair, but his confidence was beginning to waver slightly. He had expected to rattle De Niro, but he hadn't anticipated this level of controlled fury. Still, he pressed on, apparently believing he could maintain control of the situation. "Look, I'm just asking the questions that America wants answered," Kimmel said, trying to regain his composure. "People are concerned about celebrities who've lost their grip on reality." "Lost my grip?" De Niro's voice cracked like a whip. "I've been working in this industry longer than you've been alive. I've seen presidents come and go. I've watched this country change, and I've earned the right to speak my mind about what I see happening." His passion was evident now, the careful control he had maintained throughout his career giving way to raw emotion. "You want to talk about losing grip on reality? What about a talk show host who thinks ambushing guests makes for good television?" The production staff behind the cameras began to look nervous. This was uncharted territory for a late-night show, and no one seemed sure how to handle the escalating situation. Camera operators continued filming, but their movements suggested uncertainty about whether they should keep rolling. The director, visible in the control booth, appeared to be having an animated discussion with his team about how to proceed. Kimmel's mask was starting to slip. The confident smirk that had been his trademark throughout the interview was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. He had clearly prepared for a certain level of pushback, but De Niro's intensity was beyond anything he had anticipated. "Hey, let's just calm down here," the host said, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "This is supposed to be fun." "Fun?" De Niro's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "You think destroying someone's reputation is fun? You think lying to get someone on your show and then ambushing them is entertainment?" He took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, and the host instinctively leaned backward. "Let me tell you something. About fun, I've been making movies for 50 years. I know what entertainment looks like, and this isn't it. This is just cruelty dressed up as comedy." The veteran actor's words cut through the studio like a blade. Members of the audience were now clearly uncomfortable, with some beginning to whisper among themselves about what they were witnessing. The energy in the room had shifted completely from anticipation to horror, as people realized they were watching a legendary figure being systematically humiliated by someone who should have been honoring his presence. "You know what your problem is?" De Niro continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You've forgotten what respect means. You think because you have a television show, you can tear down anyone you want. You think cheap shots make you clever, but they just make you small." The actor's criticism was surgical in its precision, hitting at the core of what made Kimmel's approach so fundamentally wrong. "I came here as a professional courtesy, and you've turned it into a circus." Kimmel tried to regain control of the narrative, but his voice betrayed his growing desperation. "Look, I think you're overreacting a little bit here," he said, attempting to minimize the situation. "We're just having a conversation about current events." But even as he spoke, it was clear that he knew he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The interview had become something else entirely, and he was no longer the one steering the ship. The tension in the studio was now so thick it could be cut with a knife, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. De Niro's eyes blazed with the kind of intensity that had made him a legend, but now that fire was directed at the man sitting behind the desk who had so grossly underestimated him. "You want to know what's really crazy?" the actor said, his voice rising to fill every corner of the studio. "What's crazy is a grown man who makes his living by tearing other people down. What's crazy is someone who thinks disrespect is the same thing as humor." Kimmel's face had gone pale. The cocky confidence that had carried him through the first part of the interview had completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had poked a sleeping lion and suddenly realized the cage door was open. "Bob, I think maybe we should take a commercial break," he stammered, reaching for his coffee mug with a trembling hand. The gesture was meant to appear casual, but it only highlighted how badly he had lost control of the situation. "No," De Niro said firmly, his voice cutting through Kimmel's attempt to escape. "We're not taking a break. You started this, now you're going to finish it." The actor moved closer to the desk, and his presence seemed to fill the entire stage. "You brought me here under false pretenses. You lied to my representatives about what this interview would be. You prepared those edited clips specifically to make me look bad. And now you want to run and hide behind a commercial break?" The studio audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the raw power emanating from the legendary performer. This wasn't acting. This was Robert De Niro unleashing decades of accumulated wisdom and justified anger at someone who had fundamentally disrespected not just him, but the entire concept of professional courtesy. Camera operators continued filming, knowing they were capturing something unprecedented in television history. "I've been in this business for over 50 years, De Niro continued, his voice gaining momentum like a gathering storm. "I've worked with the greatest directors, the most talented actors, the most professional crews in the world. And in all that time, I have never encountered someone so fundamentally lacking in basic human decency as you." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep and leave lasting wounds. Kimmel tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Look, this is just how late-night television works," he said weakly. "We make jokes, we push buttons, it's all in good fun." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. He knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and everyone in the studio could see his panic. "Good fun?" De Niro's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Let me tell you what good fun looks like. Good fun is honest conversation between professionals who respect each other. Good fun is celebrating someone's work and career. Good fun is not lying to get someone on your show so you can ambush them with edited clips designed to make them look unstable." The actor's voice was now resonating throughout the studio with the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of commanding respect. The production staff behind the cameras had stopped pretending to work. Sound technicians, camera operators, even the makeup artists were frozen in place, watching the systematic dismantling of their host by one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed fascinated, but all understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" De Niro asked, his tone becoming almost philosophical. "You had the opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who's lived through some of the most important moments in entertainment history. You could have asked about working with Scorsese, about the craft of acting, about the evolution of cinema. Instead, you chose to make cheap political jokes because you thought it would get you attention." Kimmel's face was now flushed red with embarrassment and barely controlled anger. The humiliation was complete, and everyone in the studio could see it. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," he said. But his protest sounded hollow and desperate. He was a man drowning in his own poor decisions, and his attempts to save face were only making things worse. "No, you don't," De Niro agreed, straightening to his full height. "But I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real profession." The actor began to remove his microphone with deliberate, controlled movements. Each action was performed with the kind of theatrical precision that reminded everyone present why he was considered one of the greatest performers of all time. "This is what happens when you mistake meanness for humor," De Niro said, dropping the microphone onto Kimmel's desk with a sharp thud that echoed through the silent studio. "This is what happens when you think celebrity gives you the right to humiliate people who are better than you." The sound of the microphone hitting the desk was like a gavel falling, marking the end of any pretense of civilized discourse. The veteran actor turned toward the audience, and his demeanor shifted slightly. The rage was still there, but it was now tempered with the kind of dignity that had defined his entire career. "I apologize to all of you for this," he said, addressing the studio audience directly. "You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to witness what happens when someone confuses cruelty with comedy." Members of the audience began to applaud, not the polite, expected applause of a talk show, but genuine appreciation for someone who had stood up for himself with class and intelligence. The sound grew louder as more people joined in, until the entire studio was erupting in support for the legendary actor who had refused to be diminished by cheap shots and dirty tactics. De Niro nodded graciously to the audience, then turned back to Kimmel one final time. The host looked smaller now, diminished by his own actions and the spectacular way they had backfired. "You should be ashamed of yourself," the actor said quietly, but his words carried clearly throughout the studio. "You had a chance to honor the tradition of this business, and instead you chose to embarrass yourself and everyone associated with this show." With that final devastating assessment, Robert De Niro turned and walked off the stage with the same measured dignity he had brought to it. His exit was unhurried, professional, and utterly devastating in its finality. He didn't storm off in anger or throw a tantrum, he simply left, taking all the respect and authority in the room with him. The studio remained frozen for several long seconds after De Niro disappeared behind the curtain. Kimmel sat at his desk, looking like a man who had just watched his career credibility evaporate in real time. The audience continued to applaud, but now there was an edge to it, as if they were celebrating not just De Niro's dignity, but also the spectacular downfall of someone who had so thoroughly earned his humiliation. Finally, someone in the control booth had the presence of mind to cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. The most respected actor of his generation had just delivered a masterclass in how to handle a bully, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something extraordinary. In trying to diminish a legend, Jimmy Kimmel had only succeeded in diminishing himself, creating a moment that would define both men's legacies in ways he never could have imagined.